I'm going to start with really right at the World War II end and really kind of give you a little background, because Nashville did not suffer nearly as much during the Great Depression as other cities did. Now, yes, there were people laid off. We had the bank crisis that really started when Caldwell and Company closed and ended up going into bankruptcy, and that created sort of a trickle-down effect. But banking has always been very strong here, and the bankers, by and large, here in town that have run the big banks that were locally owned were rather conservative in what they invested their money in, and so we did not have the bank crises that other places have. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we didn't really kind of get the cart before the horse, and in 1935, a professor announced that he thought that the Depression was over in Nashville, and it really wasn't. But we had a good bit of employment, and the business community of Nashville, really since the very beginning, well before the Civil War, when Nashville was known as Whig City, because the Whig Party was the party that wanted the government to do internal improvements and whatnot. Nashville has had a business community that was very strong and has always had a great deal of influence in politics. That was very true during the 1840s and 50s. And you know, Nashville didn't really even support James K. Polk's presidency. And so Nashville has had a strong business community throughout its entire history. Now, here comes World War II. We also benefited in many, many ways from the New Deal. Lots and lots and lots of New Deal programs were created that benefited the city of Nashville, particularly the Works Progress Administration. And our relationship with our state senators helped this to some degree. The money that was spent here, a lot of money was spent on parks. The courthouse that we have today, which was the government house of both the city of Nashville and Davidson County, was built during the New Deal, and it was built by WPA money, and the artwork in there is absolutely magnificent, done by artists during that period of time. They spent a lot of money on roads and even potholes. Maybe we need the WPA here today, but nonetheless, they really made the city more robust. And so the Depression had a lot of people unemployed, but Nashville would survive the Depression better than other southern cities that were comparable in other southern states. So when World War II is over, we have really a changing of the guard taking place in the late 1930s and then into the early 1940s. We have some new people moving to town. Silliman Evans was a Texas New Dealer. He was, by all accounts, a liberal progressive. Now, you can interpret that however you want that to mean, but he was a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. He had bought the newspaper in Chicago, and then when the Tennessean went bankrupt, he bought the Tennessean out of bankruptcy. Now, like so many people who came here for some business reason, I'm just going to get my business running, and then I'm going back home, Silliman Evans came and he intended to go back, and he decided he was going to stay here. And I think as much as anything, Silliman Evans saw the politics here, not really so much in Nashville as the politics of the state of Tennessee, with Boss Crump over there in Memphis in full control of the city of Memphis, and also having a great deal of influence on the state government because he supported candidates that would vote the way he wanted them to vote. And he and Luke Lee, who had owned the Tennessean, but was involved with Caldwell and Company, and Luke Lee went to prison in North Carolina for a few years because of some North Carolina financial misdealings indirectly related to Caldwell and Company. So after Luke Lee went to prison, Boss Crump really had no competition. He really had a great deal of power, and he paid poll taxes for African Americans, but he made sure that those African Americans voted the way he told them to do. And so when the African Americans decided that they were going to support somebody other than the Democrat, because the African Americans have traditionally, until the Civil Rights Movement, always been Republicans, because the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln, who is credited for ending slavery. So he would get cross with his own people in Memphis, the African Americans, and but by and large he really had a lot to say of what was going on in Tennessee, even who was elected governor of the state of Tennessee. Gordon Browning, who was from West Tennessee, had been elected governor one term with the support of Crump, and when he tried to impose a tax on Memphis, Crump cut him off right there, and that was the end of that, and Crump then supported our present mayor's father, Prentice Cooper, for governor. And so Browning ended up going into the service and going to fight in World War II. He had fought in World War I, and he comes back, and now he meets Silliman Evans, and Silliman Evans is ready to get into the tangle. So Silliman Evans is going to have a big role in everything that goes on here related to urban renewal, related to school integration, related to racial integration across the city, and the development of the city. Now, here we have Silliman Evans' newspaper, and I blew this up. You can't really read it very well, but you see here I have what he had under the heading of the Tennessean after the United States declared war on Japan and we entered World War II. It says, Nashville, Tennessee, the Nashville Tennessean in the inner citadel of the, now I can't even read my own, nations, in the inner citadel of the nations. And so he wanted everybody to see Nashville as a citadel, a safe city where people could feel comfortable. And Nashville had a lot of financial benefit from the Works Progress Administration, which really set the stage for the real boom which came with World War II. At least the economic boom to the city came with World War II, because here we've got all of these investments, and the Nashville business community that controlled the industries here, and there were a lot of industries, they quickly made shifts and they expanded tremendously during the war years. So Vultee began making airplanes. The Nashville Bridge Company, which was making barges at that time, now starts making submarine chasers and minesweepers. You see the Tennessee Enamel Company now making shells and parts. An ironworks making pontoons, bridges, and other things of that nature. The Allen Manufacturing was making stoves for the Army and Navy, and then Phillips Bodorf, which was a manufacturer of stoves, was making pontoons as well. So Nashville is really thriving from the war. I mean, women are going to work, everybody feels like they're doing something, kids are having various drives to raise scrap metal, kitchen fat. Now, do you remember that kitchen fat has a component that is used in the making of bombs? And so they were doing all sorts of drives. Children were doing all sorts of drives. So Nashville is really focused on the war, but everybody is united in the fact that we are going to do our part for this to take place. So when the war ends, there is great celebration all over the United States and certainly in Nashville. The soldiers come home primarily by train, but there are parades downtown just as there had been when they came home from the Great War in 1918 and 19. And so here we have this moment, and World War II is going to be the dividing line between old Nashville and new Nashville. And that is what is going to happen here. So look at this population chart that I made yesterday. I think it really tells you a lot about what we can expect to see taking place between 1940 and 1950 as you suddenly see the part of the county here that, let's see if my pointer will work. Maybe it won't. We'll see. No, not today. You see the people are moving to the suburbs here now. And this had not happened. People lived in the city. You have the city of Nashville, and it is surrounded by rural countryside. At this point, I think the only entity that we call a satellite city today was Belmead, and it became incorporated as a city in the 1930s, primarily for zoning, to manage its own zoning. Out there in Belmead. But now you're going to see suburbs exploding, and people who lived in the city are thinking we can get a bigger and better house if we move out. And of course, one thing that really facilitates this when the soldiers come home is the GI Bill. Because not only did the GI Bill provide for education and health care, the GI Bill also provided housing money for you too. And so here you're going to see people moving out. And so they're moving from neighborhoods in the city. They're moving out. They want a ranch-style house. They want a garage that's attached to the house. They want 3 bedrooms. They want generally 2 bathrooms. And you look at these suburbs around that are now being turned into what one of my friends in real estate calls starter castles. Because the ranch-style houses are going out, and on those big acre lots out there where they had to be an acre because you had to have a septic tank, they didn't have city sewage. Now that they've got city sewage and city lights, they're becoming really desirable. So you see how the population here is going to change between 1930 and 1950. Now, you're going to see the old guard here. You see the old guard leaving. Hillary House was mayor of Nashville. He is the only mayor that they did not call it impeachment. They called it ousting. It seems that Hillary House and Edward Crump, who at this point in the 1915-16 era, they were mayors of these 2 big cities, and Tennessee had gone dry, enacted statewide prohibition 10 years before national prohibition. So Tennessee was dry, and Tom Rye, who was from Camden and Paris, Tennessee, over in West Tennessee, he was a teetotaler to begin with. So when a dry named Rye, little history humor here, anyway, he decides that the state legislature is going to pass a law to remove any state official who does not enforce prohibition. And so guess who got ousted? Boss Crump and Mayor House. So we have 2 mayors of the 2 largest cities in the state getting removed from office by a court injunction. They made no secrets about it. My voters didn't want this in the first place, and I'm not going to enforce it for the people in the rural areas who think they can tell us what to do. So does that sound familiar? So anyway, all of this is to say that Hillary House was ousted. Now, Edward Crump was ousted. He served a term or two in the U.S. Congress, didn't like that a bit, and he came back and he never held public office again. But what Edward Crump did do was that he became a very powerful political manipulator, and he had a great deal of authority. Hillary House, he didn't have any interest in anything except Nashville. His brother had a furniture store downtown. There were all sorts of things. He was kind of a crony of a lot of people. And so he sits out a few terms as mayor, and then he comes back and runs for mayor, and guess what? We overwhelmingly elect him, and he served until his death. So he served another 10 or 12 years there because he was very popular here in Nashville. And then, of course, the National Prohibition Amendment gets repealed by the amendment that removed nationwide prohibition. So Hillary House is our mayor. Now the city of Nashville will replace him when he dies, Hillary House, with Thomas Cummings. Thomas Cummings is regarded as a much more progressive person, perhaps, but he is the mayor during World War II, and when the war is over, a whole new generation of young whippersnappers who are calling them, running all over the state of Tennessee in various places as the GI ticket. He will be overthrown eventually in the 50s and not be the mayor of the city of Nashville. The county judge, now keep in mind, we have two executives. You know, we have lived here under Metro so long, 1963 when it was enacted, that it's hard for us to fathom. You've got this county out here with one set of rules and this city in here with another set of rules. But Lytton Hickman here in the upper part of this picture in the middle there was the county judge. He served for many years. The county court had magistrates that represented districts within the county, and they controlled a lot of things in the county. Keep in mind, we had a city school system and a county school system. The sheriff was the law enforcement in the county. The police were the law enforcement, and yet a lot of things in the city were taken advantage of by the people who lived in the county. And it's an interesting thing that when Luke Lee and his family donated the money, the land for Percy Warner Park and Edwin Warner Park, they were city parks, but they were out in the county. They were not in the city of Nashville. So that was a kind of an interesting thing. There was a lot of back and forth here. So we're going to have a changing of the guard. But here is another person here I want to mention because he is one of the old guard that survived going to the new guard. And that was Dr. John D. Lentz, for whom our health center is named. Dr. Lentz had grown up in the country, come to Vanderbilt to medical school. He worked at the mental hospital, Central State, for a while, and then he became the Davidson County Health Director. And he was an activist, especially in the years after the war. For one thing, Nashville, after the war, had a terrible problem with venereal disease because the prostitutes were openly working, and there were soldiers in and out of this city all the time. And so he wants disease control. He wants, when immunizations really start, the Salk vaccine and others, he really advocated getting everybody vaccinated. He also knew that this city had a serious water problem, or the county, I should say, the county had a water problem because of all of these septic tanks that people had to use that got into the groundwater from time to time. And he was very active in trying to help the county see that they needed to develop a sewer system. But why are people living in the county rather than the city? Because the taxes are lower in the county than in the city taxes. And so he will become very, very active in Nashville's affairs, and he will take over as the health director of the county. He will take over health services for the city of Nashville. So Nashville is booming. Downtown is a thriving shopping area. How many of you remember when there were 3 big department stores downtown? And you had to either head-in park or parallel park. I'm not sure that Kane Sloan, which had a garage when I got here in '71, but it may not have had that garage in the beginning, but they had restaurants, they had a little bit of everything, and they were really attractions. But in addition to these 3 department stores, Kane Sloan, Kastner Knott, and Harvey's, you had all of these locally owned mom and pop stores. Look at all these stores that are up and down the street. You had all manner of stores on the side streets, 6th Street, 7th Street, 8th Street, 5th Street. You had all manner of mom and pop stores. And you remember when you were a child, you went to the shoe store and somebody, they measured your feet, they did all these things. And if you are of a certain age, I remember us doing this very well. You went to the Red Goose shoe store, they had X-ray machines, and that was a real novelty, and only now do we know what that meant. So all the radiation children were being exposed to. But Nashville was an absolutely thriving downtown. The streets were packed with people. It was segregated. African Americans could go downtown, they could buy things. They could not eat at any of the restaurants. They could not use any of the restrooms in these stores. And remember, these restrooms, especially the women's rooms, were rooms where women, delicate creatures that we are, could go and rest. They had sofas, they had lovely things there, lovely flowers and whatnot. And they were places where you could go and sit and rest a while to rest your feet, because exercise was not really being promoted too much in these days. So among other things. So African Americans, Kwame Lillard, who passed away just a few years ago, African American member of the Metro Council, really terrific activist, participated in the sit-ins as a high school kid, the Freedom Rides, integrated the Metro swimming pools with a friend of his, and actually closed the city pool over at Centennial Park. But Kwame Lillard gave a talk out at Vol State, where I teach, for my students, and this is what stunned the students the most about all of the things he was talking about that as a child he did not understand. Mama, why can't we drink out of that water fountain? The water looks the same to me. Oh, don't you ask those questions, don't you do that. And that's what his mother would say to him. Well, in addition to the humiliation of all of that segregation, they had in the alleys behind some of the stores big sheets of cardboard put up, which essentially were the restrooms. And your child needs to go to the bathroom immediately, and that's what you have to take your child to. It had to be just a terrible experience for a mother to say, you can't go in that bathroom, you've got to come out here. And so it was a very segregated downtown. Now, having said that, Nashville is unusual among southern cities in that Nashville always had a small but energetic and influential elite component of the black community. And I think the reason that Nashville had those seeds planted there was because before the Civil War, Nashville had a small population of free blacks who created their own school to educate their own children. The person who was educated in those schools until the school, singular school, before the city shut it down, was James C. Napier, who went on to become a lawyer, a businessman, went to the United States government eventually and became he was the secretary. He was not secretary of the Treasury, but he was his name was on the printed bills. He was at the Treasury Department, the highest ranking African American in the United States government up to that period of time. And he worked in Washington under President Taft, a Republican. And then when Woodrow Wilson became president, a Democrat, one of the first things that Woodrow Wilson did was to segregate all of the federal offices in Washington, D.C., and so James Napier came back home. So Nashville had the Boyd family in printing. You have Preston Taylor. You have an elite group of African Americans who have a considerable amount of indirect influence on the white establishment. And they are consulted from time to time by the white establishment. And James Napier will serve in the city council, and there is a long period of time when we don't have any African Americans in the old city council, but you will see that this was a segregated city. Now, we got some new faces moving in here, and here's another one like Silliman Evans, who I think really is somebody that Nashville has largely forgotten. Victor Johnson ran a company in, I think it was Chicago. He had never lived in the South, but at the end of World War II, he decided to build a lunchbox factory here in Nashville. So he comes to town, he's going to get this established, and then he's going back. Well, guess what? He stayed. And he had a great deal of influence here. He was pro-growth, pro-business development. He immediately got active in the Chamber of Commerce. He got very active in promoting the city as a place for financial investments. So he will have a big hand in the consolidation of the city and county government when that actually takes place. It was my great pleasure to interview him in, I guess, about 1993 or 4. I was working on the history of metro government, and his story is really, really quite remarkable of how he stayed. So as I mentioned, Silliman Evans comes to town, this Texas New Dealer, and he immediately sees competition. The editor of the Nashville Banner. There had been a Nashville Banner newspaper before the Civil War, but the Nashville Banner gets resurrected by a German immigrant who had come to Nashville working for the L&N Railroad, and then opened this newspaper, the Banner, the Nashville Banner. And the politics of these two men, excuse me, are so unusual because on one level they were sort of philosophical, but on the other level it was kind of whatever Silliman Evans is for, Stallman's going to be against, and whatever Evans is against, Evans is going to be for. So you see this competition between these two men more than anything, but I really hated it when the Banner closed for good, because we took the morning paper and the afternoon paper, and they were filled with all sorts of things. I mean, for those of you who were here in the 70s and 80s, the things that were in the papers that we have lost, local movie reviews, local symphony reviews, local things happening here, and the fact that the publishing of the Tennessean is now done in Knoxville, I think has really been harmful to people who like to read the newspaper because you like to spread it out there. And so these two men are going to be the competition, and they are going to have a great voice at the table. So consequently, Silliman Evans had supported Tom Cummings when he was elected mayor. So when Ben West decides to run against Tom Cummings in 1952, Jimmy Stallman supports Tom Cummings just because he supports Ben West. Excuse me, I said that wrong, because Tom Cummings is being supported by Silliman Evans. So here you've got the newspapers heavily involved, and Silliman Evans, especially throughout the 40s, I mean, his mind is just going 90 miles an hour of what can we do for Nashville? How can we make this a bigger and greater city? Those ideas are still with us. So here are some things that he started editorializing in the Tennessean pages a year before the war ends. He wanted the Cumberland River included in the TVA. Now keep in mind, the TVA was one of the flagship programs of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. He picked the Tennessee River as this whole planned development, planned regional development. It wasn't just to improve river transportation, to improve navigation on the river. It wasn't just to include improving flooding and ending flooding. It included a whole host of things related to regional development, such as building these planned towns where they were building the dams. And it's a fascinating thing to look at the history of the TVA. The people in Gallatin immediately wrote Franklin Roosevelt and asked for Gallatin to be put in the Tennessee Valley Authority. But we are not in the Tennessee Valley right here in Tennessee. And so here is the oral geography lesson of the day. If you look at a map, if you come to my college Tennessee history class, the first thing I do is pass out blank maps of Tennessee and ask you to draw the Tennessee River on that map and then to draw the Cumberland. And very few students can do it. They cannot do it because the Tennessee River starts over in East Tennessee. It goes down there kind of on the western side of Chattanooga, then dips down into Alabama where the Muscle Shoals are, then it dips back up north. You're going north, but you're going downstream, and then it goes to the Cumberland River. The Tennessee River and the Cumberland River never touch. The Cumberland River begins up in eastern Kentucky. It flows down into Tennessee and up into Kentucky, and it's the place between the mouth of the Cumberland and the mouth of the Tennessee River are 12 or 14 miles apart. They're not very far when they go into the Ohio River. And then they go into the Mississippi River. So we were in no way, and still aren't, part of the valley that is the Tennessee River Valley, because the valley is the area where the water from the river comes from that river. And so there's an area, land between the lakes, and this is hard to find. I've never really found it when I've been over there, but there's a marker on the Natchez Trace for the Tennessee Divide. Think Continental Divide. And it's a little ridge that kind of runs down between these two rivers and then kind of follows the path of the Harpeth River, but not quite. But the water on one side of that ridge flows to the Tennessee, and on the eastern side and sort of northern side to the Cumberland River. So they wanted to be in it because they were too cheap. I shouldn't say that. They did not want to raise taxes to build a bridge between Sumner County and Wilson County. If you've ever taken a Boy Scout to Camp Boxwell, you know where that road is, Highway 109. And they had a ferry that operated that transportation between Sumner County and Wilson County. Well, guess what happened to the Cumberland River in the summertime? too shallow to float the barge. And so they couldn't get people across. And so they wanted to be included because they assumed that that would raise the level of the dams, would raise the level of the Cumberland River. And eventually, after the war, they did get a bridge. But nonetheless, Nashville wanted to be in the Tennessee Valley too. Now, of course, are there opponents to the Tennessee Valley Authority? Absolutely, absolutely, because there are two different sets of people who are opposing Nashville being included here. But one is that it's going to put all of the private power companies out of business. And eventually they do start buying private power companies, and so the private power companies got reimbursed in a manner of speaking. But the other problem was that they used the laws of condemnation to take people's farms and property whatever the circumstances of what they did not want to do. And so some people did not want to sell, and they went to court and they lost. They got more money from the government by going to court, I think, but they did have a nasty court fight to deal with. But Nashville, at least Silliman Evans thought we needed to be in the Tennessee Valley Authority's purview, that it would be a great boost. And he was looking at things from a business perspective. If we have more electrical power, it's cheaper, businesses will want to come to Nashville. And it's all about getting more business here at this period of time. Now, he also advocated getting rid of the poll tax. Well, that's a state issue. The TVA is a national issue. The toll tax is a state issue. It's a fee that you paid to be able to vote. And it was, in the range of from $1 to $2. When my mother died just a few years ago, her poll tax receipt was still in her wallet. And, she carried it. She was afraid, even though she was, it was a Texas poll tax receipt, that she might need to show it here in Tennessee sometime. So they wanted to get rid of the cronyism in government. Ha, ha, ha. And we want to get rid of it at the state level, but not the city level, you understand? So that translates to Mr. Crump. Okay. He wanted to consolidate the county health services, which did happen. Joe Lentz was all in favor of taking over the city's health services because he knew he could do it better than the city could, and that merged first. That was the very thing. Long before Metro, the health services were merged. The school systems, he thought, needed to be merged because he saw these people moving into the county, and the county did not have enough of a tax base to provide new schools, to build new schools in these suburbs that have never been around before. I mean, look at all of Westmead. Look at the suburbs in Creve Hall, Donaldson. That whole Donaldson area was a suburb. And you've got these suburbs growing around the city. And so he thinks that the county needs to improve their school systems. And certainly the parents who moved out there, I'm sure, felt that way as all. He wanted permanent voter registration, one time does all. He also supported extending Lafayette, as the Tennesseans here like to call it, and that did get accomplished. He wanted a smoke abatement. Now, some of you have probably heard me talk about this before, but Nashville sits in the Cumberland basin, not a basin, not a basement. It is like a soup bowl that has a big rim around it, and that rim is the Highland Rim. Consequently, air pollution in Nashville, the city, was horrendous. This was before the EPA. It was filthy. George Cate, whom many of you remember very well, he was the first vice mayor of Nashville. George Cate would tell the story that he would go downtown to work in his law office, and he would come home at the end of the day take his tie off, and his shirt would be gray, but there would be a white line down his shirt where the tie had protected the shirt from the smog, the pollution, air pollution. So Solomon Evans recognized that, and at the same time he's asking for more and more factories to come here, but yet he's got to deal with the air pollution that factories are causing. And so he wanted a smoke abatement. He wanted a sewage disposal plant. We've got people on the sewers, but guess where the water's going? The Cumberland River. Boy, doesn't that make you feel good if you're in Clarksville drinking the water that's coming from here? So anyway, the sewage disposal plant, in case you don't know, it's over there across from Metro Center on the inner loop. It's right beside the Cumberland River, and they do clean up what they put back in the Cumberland River. But if you go to Shelby Bottoms, you see across the river there and walk the Greenway, you see the Omohundra water treatment plant where the water comes out of the Cumberland River, and then downstream is the sewage plant that puts it back in the Cumberland River. So nonetheless, if you start thinking about that, you probably won't drink any more water. But actually, if you've ever been to the Omohundra water treatment plant, you will come away from there awed, absolutely in awe of the people who work there. Yes?
I think I did the tour with you, and I think one of my takeaways was the water that they're putting back in the Cumberland is actually cleaner when it's all said and done than what they're taking in. So.
And these folks, you know, we take everybody who works for Metro, now that's some of you sitting back there against the wall, and we take these people for granted. But Metro has some of the most dedicated public servants you will ever find. There are people who are biologists who have worked for the water department for 30 and 40 years. And I think on the tour that you were with me when we went out there to the water treatment plant, Dr. Doug Mitchell was in tow, and he is a retired gastroenterologist. And so he starts talking chemicals with the water guys, and I mean, it was so far over my head, but I was just fascinated because Doug, a gastroenterologist, came away from there thinking, the water here is fit to drink, it's clean. So we did get a sewage disposal plant. He wanted a municipal auditorium. And how many of those have we had since you have lived here? I think we're on number 3, right? So he wanted that round building down there. That was part of what we're going to talk about here in a minute. So here is the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, and they have always had a great deal of influence. And so now they're going to have even more influence now that the war's over, and this is an opportune time for things to go. They want some dams to control flooding. The Cumberland River flooded in Nashville in 1950. And of course, where did the poorest people in the city live? Along the river, and it flooded this area where a lot of African Americans lived west of the state capitol and north of the state capitol. It flooded that whole area and destroyed people's homes. So the Chamber of Commerce wants some dams to control that. The Chamber of Commerce thinks the city government needs to be reformed. They're not really pushing for consolidation with the county, but they need some kind of structural change that they think will be better than the current system. They wanted traffic reform and street improvement. I'll vote for that. So, you know, we kind of walled ourselves in, haven't we, with all these things we've allowed to be built up at the edge of the street. Once again, Lafayette, widening Broadway and West End. It's all about moving people, cleaning up the water, taking some of our city water and selling it out there in the counties and letting them benefit from our sewage system to keep their water cleaner, changing a lot of things related to government, and they are going to push uniting the school systems. And this is what Don Doyle, who taught for many years at Vanderbilt and wrote a very fine book, He wrote actually 2 very fine books that are actually the very best sources of Nashville history from after the Civil War. The first one is Nashville in the New South, and it goes from 1870 to 1920, and then the second book, Nashville after 1920, I think is the name of it, goes from 1920 up through about 1990. We need to kind of add to that story now, but his books are very fine. They're very scholarly, and they've got lots of footnotes. So the federal government is going to help us out once again. And I am, you remember the GI Bill. I heard Bobby Lovett talking about when the GI Bill came to Tennessee State University. Bobby Lovett is a retired professor from there who wrote a very fine book on the history of African Americans in Nashville up to 1930, and then he wrote a bigger volume about the civil rights movement in Tennessee, which is a very fine volume as well. And so he said that there were so many GIs that were single coming to TSU that they didn't have dormitory space, and they literally let them sleep in the auditorium, in the gymnasium. I mean, they were bedding students who were eager to take advantage of the GI Bill. And as I said earlier, the GI Bill also really was a great boost to housing, to medical care for these veterans. Lots and lots of things benefited from that. The Housing Act of 1949 comes along, and it's going to have a major impact on Nashville, because this is where the seeds of urban renewal get started, in this Housing Act of 1949. There had been some federal housing establishments built in, they call them projects of the federal government. These housing projects were built in the 30s, and now this is going to provide for more housing projects, but also going to include clearing land, using the laws of condemnation to clear neighborhoods out. And you know, people can look at a neighborhood and say, well, this is just a slum. I mean, look at this. Look, this is just a slum. But if that's where you're living, and that's the only place you've got to live, you're going to have a different look at that. And so I remember, I think it was Kwame Lillard who told me that they were living in that area where James Robertson Parkway is behind the Capitol. And he said, you know, they had no choice but to move to a housing project. And he, I guess, looking at it from the lens of his life, he said, you know, it was just demeaning that they were paid something for the land, but probably not what it's worth today. And they were forced to move. Brenda Wynn, who's now the county clerk, you get your parking sticker from her. She said that she, as a child, was very happy when they moved to the projects, because in her family, she felt it was a step up, because they had running water, but they had no heat, and there were other things. So she was happy. But this was really what it was mainly used for, the urban renewal projects here in Nashville, and especially the next one that comes along in 1954. So here comes this new group of whippersnappers that are going to replace the old guard. Beverly Briley is going to run for county judge, and he will get elected county judge and take office in 1951 and preside over this big, bulky county court. Ben West will challenge Tom Cumming. Briley, by the way, was a veteran. He had been in the Navy during World War I. He is a veteran. When he comes home from World War II, excuse me, he wasn't in World War I. He was in World War II. He comes home from the Navy, And he and a lot of other veterans from the armed forces come home across the country. This is not just in Tennessee, but they come home and they say, you know, the way things are running here is wrong, and we're going to take over. In Athens, Tennessee, they had what is now called in the history books the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, because some young GIs overthrew the political machine that controlled McMinn County over there above Chattanooga. And so Beverly Briley and a lot of these young whippersnappers who've come home from the Army, Cecil Branstetter was one of them, if you remember Cecil, they formed the GI ticket. And a lot of these young men coming home from the Army felt a commitment to public service. And so you have a lot of these men who get elected to the General Assembly, and they serve a term or two, but they feel they fulfill their public service, and they will then return to what is generally the law practice. But you're going to see West is supported by the Banner, and Briley is supported by the Tennessean. And so these are the rivalries here that we've got as we proceed. Now, two other people who have a great deal of influence here are two black lawyers. You know the name Luby because the Luby Center is named for Z. Alexander Luby. Zechariah Alexander Luby. He was born in the Caribbean. His English was absolutely like an Englishman's. He had the most beautiful accent. I've listened to several recordings of him talking. He had gone to Columbia University and gotten a law degree from Columbia University, a master's degree in law from New York University. He had come south. He initially set up practice in Memphis, but he didn't like being over there with Crump, and so he moved to Nashville, and he becomes a pillar of the African American community. There was a separate African American law school here in town, which he helped to establish, the Kent Law School, and one of the recipients of the opportunity to go to the Kent Law School was Bob Lillard. Bob Lillard and Alexander Luby will both get elected to the city council in Nashville, and they will be the first African Americans elected in 40 years when they join the city council. So here you've got these two men who are really could not have had different lives. Lillard was born poor. He became a worker in the city garage. He eventually became a fireman. He went back to working in the city garage, even though he passed the bar exam, because the opportunities for a black lawyer were limited, and Avon Williams is here by this point as well, and he eventually will start practicing law and will be appointed as a district judge, which is what he was doing at the time that he died. But here you have these two men elected to the City Council of Nashville. And so this really is giving African Americans a seat at the table, but they're going to always be outvoted in the council by the white members of the council, and yet the voices are being heard. You know, they may be being heard on deaf ears for a while, but eventually some people will say, hey, what's with this? Why are we doing this? So anyway, here you've got Ben West, the city mayor, and Beverly Briley, and they're studying the maps. They're really enjoying the maps. They're looking at the maps and trying to decide what to do. So they want to take advantage. Both of them have one thing that they agree on, and that is getting as much business into the city, investment in the city as we can possibly recruit. And so they work actively to get the Ford plant here. They will be working to keep the insurance companies here, to support the banks. They are active in recruiting, and they will do whatever possible. And so when this Housing Act money becomes available, they embrace what we call urban renewal. Now, you know, they referred to this often as slum removal, but African Americans refer to it as black removal because they were the ones that suffered the most from all of this redesigning of the maps that we had. So they were the ones that suffered the most. I mean, this is what this looked like. It was called Hell's Half Acre. And that was where white people went to gamble. That's where white people went and did all sorts of things. But black people didn't go to the white people's bars, I can assure you of that. So nonetheless, this is looking at the Capitol from, imagine down there where, well, kind of where the municipal auditorium is, looking up towards the Capitol. Yes, Mike?
You mentioned earlier that north of the Capitol flooded. Is that this area?
This area west of the Capitol and where Briley Parkway is, James Robertson Parkway is today. Yeah, it flooded. That part flooded, and it happened quite regularly. You know, I think you've read that book about the Mississippi River flood of 1927, Rising Tide, and it had a real after effect because it was December before Nashville flooded in 1927, even though that flood had occurred months earlier in the Mississippi part of that Mississippi River floodplain. And so Nashville has had floods. 2010 wasn't our first, but I think the flooding in 1950 really made people want some dams to control flooding. I think that was part of the effort to get some control. The Corps of Engineers is the one who will build Percy Priest Dam and Old Hickory Dam. And keep in mind that Franklin Roosevelt's plan for the Tennessee Valley Authority was that this is going to be the first of many valley authorities. His plan was that this would be the model, and it was regional planning. And of course, who got mad from the very beginning when Senator Norris from Nebraska pushed this bill through Congress? The Army Corps of Engineers, because the Army Corps of Engineers had always been in charge of the rivers. And that was part of the big debate down there at Memphis between the civil engineers and so on and so forth. And so the Corps of Engineers was furious. Look at this big pile of money that we could be getting. And so they were not happy about this. Well, who gets credit in the government for winning World War II? The Corps of Engineers, because they developed the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb that officially ended the war. And so there were no more TVAs. There were no more valley authorities. And so the Old Hickory Dam and the Percy Priest Dam were built by the Corps of Engineers. Yes? That's right.
Like religious and secular engineers, because there was a priesthood of engineers that controlled everything. And a lot of engineering schools, like Georgia Tech, wherever, were formed about 1870, 1880, started to compete with those guys for.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee was a member of the Corps of Engineers. So from West Point. He was trained as an engineer at West Point. Somebody had a question over here? Okay. Well, anyway, raise your hand and I'll be glad to hear what you have to say. So anyway, this is what's going to be cleaned up. If I'm losing the word cleaned up, it's going to be repurposed. Let's just say that. It's going to be completely repurposed. So here is what the flood looked like when it flooded North Nashville, pretty much to the farmers market area where the farmers market is today, and it caused a lot of trouble. So as urban renewal is embraced by the Chamber of Commerce, the mayor of the city, the judge of the county. We're going to have 3 different urban renewal projects. The first one will be the Capitol Hill redevelopment, which is, as you see where the Capitol is in the middle of the map, that is what is going to clear all of that poverty out, move them out, and build James Robertson Parkway, which will go around and ultimately get over there close to the river, and that Gay Street connector is eventually built to connect things up. But that's all of that area where Channel 5 studios are. There are 2 state office buildings over there today, but all of that were African American neighborhoods that were cleaned out. And the municipal auditorium was part of that. And Nashville, I remember Nashville had a robust African American elite community of business people. There were robust African American businesses along Fifth Avenue. The National Baptist Publishing House was down there, and it was a huge operation. And oh my goodness, what a beautiful building that was. It still is, but the denomination has had they may not have sold it yet, but the denomination is in the process of having to sell it because it was an African American publishing house, and it is a truly magnificent building. It's got so much architectural character, and it was designed by the McKissicks, who were African American architects here in town. And if we lose that building, it will be a great tragedy. But it's absolutely magnificent. It's got a chapel in it that I thought would be a great place for community groups to meet. It could be repurposed with a restaurant or 2, some offices or 2. It's got 2 big bank vaults in the basement that will have to be blasted out. But it's got good bones. It's got good bones. So urban renewal, today it is a much more controversial subject. It was controversial in 1949 and 50 and 51 and 52, but white people had their ears largely closed to the controversy. And I think that people now see the price that the African American community had to pay for this. Now, another thing I'm going to talk about next week, we're almost out of time here, is the location of the interstate highways, because the interstate highways are part of this kind of rebuilding that we're doing in the 50s, the plan to connect the major cities with these big expressways, as they were often called, where entrances and exits were limited, and consequently things could move and people could move faster. And so in addition to the African American community being hit by the Capitol Hill development, they're also going to be hit by the location of especially Interstate 40, because Interstate 40 was originally planned to go down Highway 70. Now, what does that mean? Right through Belmead. And they decided to move it over parallel to Jefferson Street. And so if you want to be shocked, go drive over on the Jefferson Street side of I-40 and make left turns. And every one of those streets dead ends right into that wall. And so that is still a very difficult subject related to race relations, the location of that interstate, because it put a lot of businesses on Jefferson Street out of business as well. And now the latest worry is the explosive gentrification that is happening. Now, another one of we had 3 big urban renewal projects here. Capitol Hill was first, and then we had the Edge Hill project, which kind of redid 16th and 17th over there, leading to Musica and Music Row. That was part of this Edge Hill project. And again, the location of I-65 going south was very consciously put. And so that affected the South Nashville African American population more than it affected any other group in the city. And then you have the University Center, and this one in particular, all of these were controversial in that eventually some of this land that was condemned by the federal government was not used by a government entity like the state or the city. I mean, Municipal Auditorium was the city's, and I guess James Robertson Parkway was the state, but it was used for the benefit, the condemnation of land was used for the benefit of Vanderbilt University, and that is that whole development. That would not take place today. I can't imagine. I think there would be a huge uproar if that were to take place today. But that's when Blakemore Avenue got widened and cut through there. And the original plan was, as I understand it, St. Thomas was going to move pretty much there where the Regions Bank is at 31st. Is that 31st or 32nd where the Regions Bank is at West End? Yeah, so they were going to be there, and then they owned that property out there where St. Cecilia was, so they decided to put the hospital out there on that property. But the university redevelopment was probably the most controversial, and I talked to John Siegenthaler about these things a lot at various times, and he said that was the piece that was really the most, that haunted him the most, the university piece. And so he said that was the real that he was young and he didn't think anything of the Capitol Hill development, but he had his last years. He pondered these things tremendously. And so this is where we leave today. Now, I've got a little time for some questions and answers and comments. Next week, the way that I'm planning this is not exactly chronological, but it's sort of chronological. We're going to take about school desegregation next week and the challenges of that and what happened here in Nashville then. And then we're going to the next week talk about the creation of metropolitan government. And the next week we'll talk about Nashville becoming the it city. So don't ride your pedal taverns here, please. Yes?
What was the beautiful building? Wasn't the, tell us again which one?
Oh, it's the National Baptist Publishing House. And it's on Charlotte. It's right by the Municipal Auditorium. And it's between the Municipal Auditorium and the courthouse. And when it first came on the market, David Briley was the mayor. He was been vice mayor, and he was the mayor. And so he appointed a committee, and I was on it to study the building and see what possibilities it was for Metro, what could Metro buy it and use it, because I think a lot of people really felt like that the developers were going to get it, and so it was just a great pleasure to go in that building and see it, and the Baptists aren't, none of these publishing houses are printing Sunday school books and all of those study books and things anymore, but the fact of the matter was, by spending $15 million for a building was going to be expensive. And so that did not take place. And I'll see if I can check on that, see what the status of that is, because it's the denomination, like so many other denominations, is shrinking. Yes?
A couple of the people mentioned extending Lafayette Street. To my knowledge, it connects into Murfreesboro Road now.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that.
Well, that was just kind of a city street through there, and it was full because it was part of a state highway. It was full of strip motels, the old drive-in motels. Drive in, park your car, go to the door. It had all of those there when I was here at graduate school, and it was kind of at both ends of that street. It was just a city street. Sears kind of anchored one end, and then you could keep going on out. But you see, it's wedged in between two interstates. So they did probably some work on it, but I don't think they ever got what they wanted. And now that there's, that new roundabouts over there, and it's even harder to kind of get over there to Lafayette. So that's kind of been, cordoned off, so to speak, itself. So it's another part of town that has suffered. But it was robust with the motel business when those strip line, drive-in motels were popular. Any other questions? I'll tell you one thing I'm going to do next week. I'm not going to do it during class because it will take 20 minutes, and I haven't discussed this with my gurus here, my handlers, but I want to show a video at 11. I'll start at, let's just say, at 11, and it is done by the public library. It was written by John Edgerton, and it is about school integration. It's 20 minutes long. And I'm going to show that at the very end if we can just hang out here for a little bit long. We can be a little late. But I do have to thank the folks here at the Sevier Park. They have welcomed us with open arms. And so I hope you'll take advantage of some of the classes and things they offer if you live in this neighborhood. You all have a great day, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.